The air inside Chandler Hall was thick with a kind of magic, a mixture of old wood, velvet seats, and the quiet hum of anticipation. For the young woman sitting just behind the heavy velvet curtain, that hum felt like a swarm of bees in her stomach. Her name was Elara Vance, and tonight was the night. All those years, all those countless hours spent in dusty rooms with only the 88 black and white keys for company, had led to this very moment. She could feel the slight vibration of the audience shifting in their seats, a low murmur that was like the sound of a distant ocean. She took a deep, shaky breath, the scent of her own rose-scented perfume, a small, familiar comfort in the overwhelming grandeur of it all. Backstage, it was a controlled chaos. A stagehand gave her a thumbs up, a fellow musician wished her a whispered, "Good luck," but it all felt like it was happening to someone else. Elara's world had shrunk to the pounding of her own heart and the cool, smooth feel of the piano keys she was imagining in her mind. She thought of her small apartment, of the second-hand upright piano that had been her whole world. She thought of the times she had to choose between buying new sheet music and buying groceries, the sacrifices her family had made, the lonely nights when she wondered if it was all worth it. Tonight, she told herself, it would be worth it. This wasn't just a performance. It was a declaration. A declaration that all the struggle, all the doubt, had been for a reason. Then, the announcer's voice boomed through the hall, a rich, deep baritone that seemed to shake the very floorboards. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chandler Hall for our debut recital this evening. We are thrilled to present a prodigious new talent, a pianist who will surely capture your hearts. Please welcome Elara Vance." The curtain began to rise, a wave of brilliant, warm light washed over her, and for a second she was blinded. She could see the sea of faces, a blur of expectation in the dim light of the auditorium. Her legs felt like lead as she walked toward the grand piano sitting center stage, a gleaming black monster that was both her greatest friend and her most terrifying challenge. She reached it, smoothed her gown, and sat on the bench. The familiar scent of wood polish and old music filled her senses, and suddenly the world snapped back into focus. The buzzing in her stomach quieted. This was her home. She placed her fingers on the keys, feeling the cool ivory under her fingertips. She paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment, gathering the energy of the room. Then she began to play. The first notes were like a question asked in a quiet room, clear and full of longing. They floated into the vast space of the hall, and a hush fell over the audience. It was as if everyone was holding their breath with her. As the piece unfolded, her fingers, which had felt clumsy with nerves just moments before, began to dance. They flew across the keys with a life of their own, coaxing out a cascade of sound that was at once powerful and delicate. The music wasn't just a series of notes. It was a story. It was a story of her own journey, of the sadness and the joy, the frustration and the triumph. She poured every ounce of her being into the performance, her eyes closed, her body swaying with the rhythm. She wasn't just playing the piano anymore. She was having a conversation with it, and the whole world was listening. In the third row, a man sat with a stern, unsmiling face. His name was Alistair Finch, and he was the most feared music critic in the city. Known simply as the Finch in artistic circles, his word was law. A good review from him could launch a career into the stratosphere, while a bad one could bury it so deep it might never see the light of day again. He watched Elara, his pen poised over a small leather-bound notebook. He didn't smile. He didn't sway with the music. He analyzed. He saw the flawless technique, the perfect precision of every note. He saw the way her hands moved, a blur of practiced perfection. But as he listened, his expression hardened. He heard the passion, yes, but to his jaded ear it felt practiced, rehearsed. He believed true art was raw, messy, and unpredictable. What he saw on stage, he decided, was a brilliant performance, a beautiful imitation of passion, but not the real thing. It was too clean, too perfect. It lacked the soulful imperfection that, in his mind, defined true genius. He scribbled a few words in his notebook, technically impeccable, emotionally curated. The pen in his hand felt like a surgeon's scalpel. ready to cut away what he saw as the pretense and reveal what he believed was the hollow core beneath for Elara. However, the experience was anything but hollow. As she reached the crescendo of the piece, a wave of pure, unadulterated joy washed over her. The music soared, filling every corner of the hall, and she felt a connection with the audience she had never experienced before. She could feel their collective emotion, their rapt attention, and it fueled her. She poured more of herself into the music, pushing the tempo, her fingers flying faster and faster until the final, thundering chord echoed through the hall and hung in the air like a star. Silence. For a single, heart-stopping moment, there was only the sound of her own breathing. Then someone in the back row started to clap. It was quickly followed by another, and another, until the entire hall erupted in a roar of applause. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a visceral, thunderous ovation. People were on their feet, their faces alight with emotion. A woman in the front row was wiping tears from her eyes. The sound was so loud, so overwhelming, that it felt like a physical force. Elara stood up, her own vision blurred with tears, and bowed. The applause only grew louder. She bowed again, her heart so full of happiness it felt like it might burst. This was it. This was the feeling she had been chasing her entire life. In that moment, standing in the warm glow of the stage lights, surrounded by the sound of pure appreciation, she felt invincible. She had done it. She had arrived. Backstage, the scene was one of pure celebration. People hugged her, congratulated her, their faces beaming. Her hands were shaking, but this time it was from adrenaline and pure bliss. She had done it. She had conquered the stage and the audience, and she felt like she was floating on a cloud. As she was led away from the noise and the lights, she didn't see the man in the third row who was already slipping out of the hall, his face grim and determined. She didn't see him pull out his phone and send a brief, cryptic message. And she had no idea that as she was celebrating the greatest night of her life, Alistair Finch was already sitting at his desk, the harsh light of a lamp glinting off his glasses, a blank page in front of him, ready to write the words that would bring her whole world crashing down. The morning sun spilled through the cracks in her blinds, painting golden stripes across her bedroom floor. Elara woke up with a smile, the feeling of the previous night's applause still buzzing in her veins like a sweet, lingering song. It was more than just a good dream. It was the best dream of her life, and it had actually happened. She stretched, feeling a lightness in her body she hadn't felt in years. Today, she thought, everything changes. Today, the world sees what her old teacher saw, what her family believed in. Today, she was no longer just a student with promise. She was a pianist. She hummed a tune from her performance as she put on the coffee, the aroma filling her small apartment with a comforting warmth. She couldn't wait to see the papers. Her agent had told her that the big critics would be there, and a good review from the Arts Chronicle was the key that could unlock every door she had ever dreamed of walking through. She imagined the headlines, the glowing words describing her music. She pictured her parents' proud faces as she read them over the phone. With a steaming mug in her hands, she sat down at her small kitchen table, opened her laptop, and navigated to the Arts Chronicle website. Her heart was thumping with a happy, excited rhythm, and then she saw it. The headline wasn't glowing. It was cold and sharp like a piece of broken glass. Virtuoso's hands, a novice's heart. Underneath it, the byline was the one name in the city that could make a musician's blood run cold, Alistair Finch. For a moment, her brain refused to process the words. Virtuoso's hands. That part was good, right? But a novice's heart? What did that even mean? Her fingers felt clumsy as she clicked on the link, the coffee in her mug suddenly smelling bitter and burnt. The words appeared on the screen, and they were worse than she could have ever imagined. The review was a masterpiece of cruelty, disguised as intelligent critique. He acknowledged her talent, but it was the kind of acknowledgement a butcher might give a fine piece of meat before carving it up. Miss Vance possesses a technical proficiency that is, without question, astonishing, he wrote. Her fingers move with a precision that is almost inhuman. She felt a small flicker of pride, but it was instantly extinguished by the next sentence. But precision is not passion. A perfectly executed algorithm is not art. What the audience witnessed last night was not the outpouring of a soul, but a masterclass in soulless mimicry. The words hit her like a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs. Soulless? Mimicry? She read on, her eyes wide with disbelief, each sentence a fresh wound. He called her performance a beautiful, hollow shell, and technically proficient but emotionally vacant. He didn't just critique her playing. He questioned her very essence, her reason for being on that stage. One leaves the performance wondering if Miss Vance has ever truly felt joy or sorrow, or if she has only learned to replicate the sounds associated with them. He ended with the final brutal twist of the knife. We have a new machine in our midst, not a musician. A brilliant, beautiful machine, but a machine nonetheless. She slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing in the sudden oppressive silence of her apartment. The coffee sat cold and forgotten in front of her. The golden stripes of sunlight on the floor now looked like bars on a cage. She felt sick. The memory of the thundering ovation, the tears of joy in the audience's eyes, the feeling of pure connection she had with the music, it all felt like a lie. How could she have been so wrong? How could all those people have felt something that wasn't there? Or was the real truth that only he, Alistair Finch, was smart enough to see the fraud she really was? The phone started to ring. It was her agent, no doubt calling to celebrate. She stared at it, letting it ring and ring until it finally stopped. She couldn't talk to anyone. What would she say? Hi, yes, the performance was great, but I'm actually a soulless machine. A critic figured it out. She felt a hot wave of shame wash over her. She curled up on her chair, pulling her knees to her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she started to cry. But these weren't tears of joy. They were tears of humiliation and despair. The next few days were a blur of pain. The review was everywhere. It was shared on social media, discussed in online forums, and quoted by other musicians. The Finch's verdict was final, and it seemed the whole world had accepted it. The calls from her agent stopped being about celebration and started being about damage control. A small concert she had scheduled for the next month was quietly postponed. The organizers of a master class she was supposed to teach suddenly had a scheduling conflict. The opportunities that had been blooming just days ago were now wilting and dying on the vine. The worst part was that his voice got inside her head. It became a constant, cruel companion. She tried to practice, to prove him wrong, but the moment her fingers touched the keys, all she could hear were his words. She would play a soft, gentle passage, and a voice in her mind would sneer, replicating the sounds of sadness. She would launch into a fast, complex run, and the voice would say, "Look at the machine perform." The piano, her oldest and dearest friend, had become her accuser. The joy she used to feel, the escape she found in the music, was gone. In its place was a paralyzing anxiety. Every note she played was a judgment. Her fingers, which once danced, now felt stiff and heavy, as if they were weighed down by the critic's words. She started to isolate herself. She ignored the calls from her old mentor, the maestro, unable to bear the thought of seeing the pity in his eyes. She avoided her friends at the conservatory, sure they were all whispering about her behind her back. She felt like everyone was looking at her and seeing only the hollow shell that Alistair Finch had described. Her small apartment, which had once felt like a sanctuary, became a prison. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy and judgmental, filled with the ghosts of the notes she could no longer bring herself to play. Weeks turned into a month, and the bright, hopeful young woman who had woken up on top of the world was now a shadow of herself. She stopped looking at music websites. She stopped listening to the radio. She just existed in a quiet, gray fog of self-doubt. The confidence she had worked so hard to build, the belief in herself that had carried her through countless hours of lonely practice, had been shattered into a million tiny pieces. Alistair Finch hadn't just written a bad review. He had taken a shard of glass and carved out the very heart of her artistry, leaving a wound so deep she didn't know if it would ever heal. She would sit for hours in the dark, just looking at the piano, feeling like a stranger in her own life, wondering if the critic was right all along. The silence in Ilara's small apartment had become a physical thing. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over everything, muffling the sounds of the world outside. 6 months had passed since the review, 6 months since the music had died. The grand piano, which had once been the vibrant heart of her home, now sat like a silent tomb in the corner of the living room. A fine layer of dust had settled on its glossy black surface, dulling its shine. The ivory keys, once so familiar and alive under her touch, looked yellowed and cold like old teeth. She hadn't lifted the lid in months. She couldn't bear to. Her life had shrunk to the size of her apartment and the small, gray cubicle she now occupied at a data entry job. The work was mind-numbingly repetitive, an endless stream of numbers and keystrokes, but in a way it was a comfort. It required no passion, no emotion, no soul. It was exactly what Alistair Finch had accused her of being, a machine. And so she played the part. She woke up, she went to work, she came home, she ate a microwave dinner, and she went to sleep. The vibrant, hopeful young woman who had once soared on a stage was gone, replaced by a ghost who moved through the motions of a life she no longer recognized. The critic's words were still there, a constant, looping soundtrack in her mind. They were the first thing she heard when she woke up and the last thing she heard before she fell into a restless sleep. Soulless mimicry, a beautiful hollow shell, a machine, not a musician. They had become her truth. She saw herself as he had seen her, a fraud who had tricked everyone for a little while, until someone smart enough had come along to expose her. The joy she had once felt in music was now a distant memory, like a dream from someone else's life. Sometimes she would hear a snippet of a piano piece playing in a store or on a television commercial, and a sharp, piercing pain would shoot through her chest. It was a reminder of everything she had lost, of the person she used to be. She would quickly change the station or leave the store, running away from the ghost of her own happiness. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, a key turned in the lock of her apartment door. Ilara was curled up on the sofa, staring at the blank television screen, and she didn't even have the energy to be startled. The door opened, and a tall, elderly man with a shock of white hair and a kind, weathered face stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. It was Maestro Roth, her old teacher and mentor. He hadn't called ahead. He never did. He just showed up when he felt she needed him most. He took in the scene with a sad sweep of his eyes, the drawn curtains, the cold pizza box on the coffee table, the dusty piano in the corner, and the young woman on the sofa who looked like a flickering candle about to go out. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked over, took off his wet coat, and sat down in the armchair opposite her. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. "I read what he wrote," he said finally, his voice gentle but firm. He didn't need to say who he was. Ilara just shrugged, her eyes still fixed on the dark screen. "He was right," she whispered, the words barely audible. Maestro Roth leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "No," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He was a man with a pen full of poison and a heart full of bitterness. He saw your technique, and because it was so brilliant, so far beyond his own ability, he decided it couldn't possibly be real. So he looked for a flaw and he invented one. He attacked your heart because he couldn't find a single thing to criticize in your hands. "It doesn't matter," she said, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. Everyone believed him. The invitation stopped. The phone call stopped. "It's over." "It's only over if you let it be," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, placing it on the coffee table between them. "The stage is the only answer to a critic, Ilara. He used words to silence you. You must use music to silence him." She looked at the paper, but she didn't touch it. "I can't." "The music. It's not there anymore. When I try to play, all I hear is his voice." "Then don't play for him," the maestro said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Don't play for the audience, or for the reviews, or for your career. Play for yourself. Play your anger. Play your hurt. Play your despair. Turn all of this pain into something beautiful. That is the only way to heal." He stood up to leave. "That," he said, pointing to the paper on the table, is an application for the International Virtuoso competition. The deadline is in 2 weeks. I'm not asking you to win. I'm asking you to show up. Let the world hear what real pain sounds like when it's played by someone who truly knows how to feel. After he left, Ilara sat in the quiet for a long time, just staring at the application. A part of her wanted to rip it up, to throw it away, to continue her slow, silent fade into nothingness. But another part of her, a tiny, forgotten spark buried deep beneath the ashes, was curious. That night, for the first time in months, she walked over to the piano. Her hand trembled as she reached out and lifted the lid, revealing the dusty keys. She wiped them clean with the sleeve of her shirt. Her fingers making contact with the cool, smooth ivory, she sat down on the bench, feeling stiff and awkward. She placed her fingers on the keys and tried to play a simple scale. It was a disaster. Her fingers were clumsy, the notes uneven and hesitant. The critic's voice screamed in her head. A machine. A hollow shell. She slammed the lid shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room, and burst into tears. It was hopeless, but the next day she found herself looking at the application again. She thought about the maestro's words, play your anger, play your hurt. On a whim, she pulled up a recording of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 on her phone. She had always loved the piece, but now, listening to it, she felt it in a whole new way. The opening chords were heavy, somber, full of a profound, almost unbearable sadness. They sounded like the feeling of waking up in the morning and remembering why your life is empty. They sounded like her pain. As she listened, the music began to shift. It moved from the deep melancholy into a restless, searching middle section, full of conflict and struggle. And then it began to build. It started to fight back, gathering strength and momentum until it exploded into a triumphant, life-affirming finale. It was the sound of a soul walking through the darkest valley and coming out into the brilliant light on the other side. It was her story. She walked back to the piano, her heart pounding with a new feeling. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was determination. She opened the lid again, and this time she didn't try to play a scale. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play the first few chords of the Rachmaninoff. They were messy, full of mistakes, but they were filled with a raw, honest emotion she hadn't felt in months. She was no longer trying to be perfect. She was just trying to tell the truth. And for the first time in a long time, the music felt real. It felt like her. The air backstage at the International Virtuoso competition was thick enough to chew. It was a strange cocktail of expensive perfume, floor wax, and the raw, metallic scent of fear. Ilara stood in the wings, her hands clammy, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. All around her, other finalists were stretching, meditating, or whispering last-minute encouragement to themselves. They were the best of the best young musicians from all over the world, and they all had the same look in their eyes, a desperate, hungry fire. But Ilara's fire was different. It wasn't just the hunger to win. It was the need to prove something, not just to the world, but to the ghost that lived in her head. For the past few weeks, she had lived and breathed Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. She had practiced until her fingers ached and her vision blurred. But it wasn't the same kind of practice as before. She wasn't just trying to perfect the notes. She was trying to perfect a feeling. She had poured every ounce of her pain, her anger, and her fragile, returning hope into the music. The piano was no longer her judge. It was her confidant. It was the one place she could be completely honest about the darkness she had been through and the small flicker of light she was now clinging to. A stagehand in a black t-shirt gave her a nod. "You're up next, Miss Vance." The words sent a jolt through her. This was it. The moment of truth. She took a deep breath, the way Maestro Roth had taught her, and walked toward the edge of the stage. The bright lights hit her like a physical wall, and for a moment she was blinded. She could feel the immense space of the concert hall in front of her, a vast, dark cavern filled with thousands of silent, watching people. Her legs felt like they were made of wood as she made the long walk to the grand piano sitting center stage. As her eyes adjusted to the light, She did something she had been both dreading and anticipating. She scanned the front row, looking for the judge's table. And then she saw him. Alistair Finch. He was sitting right in the middle, a stern, imposing figure in a dark suit. His face was a mask of cold indifference, his pen already poised over a notepad, as if he already knew what he was going to write. He didn't look at her with any malice, just a kind of bored, clinical curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. Seeing him sent a wave of nausea through her. The old voice, his voice echoed in her mind. A machine. A hollow shell. For a terrifying second, she felt her confidence begin to crumble. Her fingers felt cold and stiff. What if he was right? What if all this emotion she thought she was putting into the music was just another kind of mimicry? But then she remembered Maestro Roth's words. Play your anger. Play your hurt. She looked at Alistair Finch's unsmiling face, and a new feeling surged through her, hot and sharp. It was defiance. She wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was playing for every artist he had ever crushed, for every dream he had ever dismissed with a flick of his cruel pen. She was going to show him what a hollow shell sounded like when it was filled with a real, beating, broken, and brave heart. She reached the piano, sat down on the bench, and smoothed her gown. The familiar scent of wood polish filled her senses, grounding her. She placed her fingers on the keys, and for a moment the world fell away. There was only her, the piano, and the man in the front row. She closed her eyes, took one last breath, and began to play. The first chords that filled the hall were not beautiful. They were heavy, deep, and full of a profound, almost unbearable sorrow. They hung in the air like a funeral dirge, each note a testament to the silence and the despair she had endured. It was the sound of waking up alone in a gray room, the sound of hope draining away. The audience shifted in their seats, a collective shiver running through the hall. This wasn't the polished, perfect performance they had expected. This was something raw, something uncomfortably real. As the piece moved into its more complex middle sections, the music began to change. It became a restless, agitated storm of notes. Her fingers flew across the keys, not with the clean precision of her old performances, but with a desperate, searching energy. It was the sound of her internal battle, the fight against the voice in her head, the struggle to find her way out of the darkness. You could hear the conflict in the music, the doubt and the determination clashing, the pain and the will to survive intertwined. Her body swayed with the music, her eyes squeezed shut, her face a mask of intense concentration and emotion. She wasn't just performing the music. She was reliving it, note by painful note, and then, slowly, the music began to transform. The storm started to break. Little melodies of hope began to peek through the clouds of dissonance. The rhythm became stronger, more confident. It was the sound of a spirit refusing to be broken. The audience, which had been holding its breath, felt the shift. They were no longer just watching a performance. They were on a journey with her. They could feel her pain, but now they could feel her strength. 2. The final movement was an explosion of pure, unadulterated triumph. The music soared, filling every corner of the vast hall with a sound so powerful and full of life it felt like it could raise the roof. It was the sound of a soul breaking free, of a heart learning to beat again, stronger and more fiercely than before. Ilara's eyes were open now, shining with tears, but her face was radiant. She was no longer the broken girl from the apartment or the nervous prodigy from her debut. She was a woman who had walked through fire and was emerging, not just unscathed, but forged anew. Her fingers danced across the keys with a joyous, defiant energy, pouring out all the love she had for the music, all the gratitude for the second chance she had been given. She brought the piece to its thunderous, magnificent finale, her hands crashing down on the final chords with all the force she had. The sound echoed through the hall, a declaration of victory, and then there was silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a heavy, profound, awe-filled silence. The entire hall, thousands of people, was frozen in the moment, completely captivated, still processing the emotional journey they had just been taken on. The silence lasted for what felt like an eternity. Then, a single person in the back row began to clap. It was quickly joined by another and another until a wave of sound erupted that was so loud, so overwhelming it felt like a physical force. The entire audience was on its feet, their faces alight with emotion, some with tears streaming down their cheeks. They weren't just applauding. They were roaring, shouting, "Brava! Brava!" The sound was a tidal wave of pure, unfiltered appreciation washing over her, healing parts of her she didn't even know were still broken. Ilara stood up, her own vision blurred with tears, and bowed. The applause only grew louder. She looked out at the sea of faces, no longer seeing them as judges, but as kindred spirits who had understood. And then her eyes found the front row. Alistair Finch was still sitting. His pen had fallen from his hand and lay on the floor. His mask of indifference was gone, replaced by a look of utter shock and something else. Something that looked a lot like shame. He was pale, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes fixed on her as if he were seeing a ghost. In that moment, as the thunderous ovation rained down upon her, Ilara knew she had won. She had done more than just play the piano. She had made her cruelest critic feel the truth. The roar of the crowd was a living thing, a wild animal that filled the massive hall with its deafening cry. It wasn't just applause. It was a force, a physical wave of sound and emotion that crashed over Ilara again and again. She stood there, blinded by the lights, her own tears making everything a shimmering, beautiful blur. She bowed once, twice, 3 times, but the sound only grew louder. People were shouting, not just words, but pure, raw sounds of feeling. It was the kind of ovation that musicians dream of, the kind that comes once in a lifetime, if they are lucky. It was the sound of connection, of thousands of strangers feeling the exact same thing at the exact same time. All because of the music she had made. Through the blur, she saw the other judges on their feet, clapping with genuine, unreserved admiration. Their faces, which had been so stern and professional during the performances, were now open and full of emotion. But her eyes kept being drawn back to the front row, to the one person who wasn't standing. Alistair Finch remained in his seat, a solitary, unmoving figure in a sea of celebration. His pen was on the floor, and his hands were resting limply on the table in front of him. He wasn't looking at the audience or the other judges. He was looking at her, and the look on his face was one she would never forget. It was a look of complete and utter devastation, as if the foundations of his world had just been shattered. In that moment she felt no triumph, no sense of revenge. All she felt was a strange, quiet sense of peace. She had her answer. The music had been enough. The master of ceremonies, a kind-faced man with a gentle voice, finally walked onto the stage, holding up his hands to quiet the crowd. It took several long moments for the sound to die down to a low, excited hum. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice full of awe, I don't think I have ever witnessed anything quite like that. He paused, shaking his head as if to clear it. "We have one more finalist to perform, but I think it's safe to say that we have all just witnessed something truly special." "Ilara Vance, thank you." He was about to turn and signal for the next performer when a movement from the judges' table caught everyone's eye. Alistair Finch slowly pushed his chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the floor, a jarring sound in the now quiet hall. Every head turned. He stood up, his movements stiff and uncertain like a man learning to walk again. He walked toward the master of ceremonies, his face pale and drawn. The MC looked at him, confused, but Finch simply held out his hand for the microphone. After a moment's hesitation, the MC gave it to him. Finch walked to the center of the stage, the same spot where Ilara had just poured out her soul. He stood for a long moment, just looking out at the silent, waiting audience. The hand holding the microphone was trembling slightly. He took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice, usually so sharp and confident, was thick with an emotion that sounded suspiciously like shame. "A few months ago," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the vast hall, "I wrote a review about a young pianist. Her name was Ilara Vance." A murmur went through the crowd, and he paused, swallowing hard. "In that review, I used words to dissect her spirit. I called her performance soulless mimicry. I called it a beautiful hollow shell. I wrote that we had a new machine in our midst. Not a musician? He looked down for a moment, as if the words were too heavy to hold. I have been a critic for over 30 years. I have built my career on the belief that my role is to protect the art form from mediocrity, to cull the herd. I believe that true genius was raw and messy, and that perfection was a sign of emotional emptiness. I was arrogant. I was cynical. And I was wrong. He lifted his head and his eyes found Ilara's, standing just a few feet away. What I called hollow was a depth I was too jaded to see. What I called soulless was a soul so profound, so full of quiet strength, that it took immense pain to find its true, powerful voice. The performance you just gave was not a performance. It was an act of courage. It was the sound of a heart breaking and then choosing to beat again, louder and more fiercely than ever. He turned to face the audience, but his words were still for her. Art is not about what the critic sees or hears. It is about the truth. And tonight, Miss Vance, you spoke the truth. And it shamed my own. He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a humility that no one had ever seen in him before. He held the microphone in both hands as if it were a heavy weight. Miss Vance, he said, his voice clear and ringing with sincerity, I am deeply, profoundly sorry. A stunned silence fell over the hall. No one could believe what they were witnessing. The most feared critic in the country, the man who had never apologized for anything in his life, was standing on stage, publicly admitting he was wrong. Then someone in the audience began to clap. It was a slow, respectful clap at first, but then it grew, spreading through the hall until it was another thunderous ovation, but this time it was for both of them. It was for her courage and for his. Ilara felt a wave of something so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. It wasn't happiness. It was release. It was the final letting go of all the pain, all the doubt, all the anger. She looked at the man who had tried to destroy her, who had haunted her darkest days, and she saw not a monster, but a flawed, broken man who had finally seen the light. She gave him a small, genuine nod of acceptance. A tiny, forgiving smile touched her lips. The rest of the evening felt like a dream. The last finalist played, but their music, though brilliant, was overshadowed by the emotional storm that had just passed. When the time came for the results, there was no real suspense. The master of ceremonies walked back to the microphone, a wide smile on his face. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, the winner of the International Virtuoso competition and the recipient of the Grand Prix is Ilara Vance. The applause was deafening once more. They placed a heavy golden trophy in her hands, but it felt strangely light. It was just a thing, a symbol. The real prize she had already received. It was the feeling of the music flowing through her again, pure and true. It was the look of understanding on an old critic's face. It was the quiet peace that had settled in her own heart. Later, long after the crowd had gone and the stage was dark, she was backstage, packing her sheet music into a bag. The trophy sat on a table next to her. She heard a soft cough and turned to see Alistair Finch standing in the doorway of her dressing room. He looked smaller in the dim light, less intimidating. I meant what I said, he said quietly, not coming any closer into the room. I know, she said, her voice soft. Thank you. He nodded, his eyes darting to the trophy and then back to her. The world will be listening now, he said. It wasn't a threat or a prediction. It was a simple statement of fact. Don't let them change the music. She smiled, a real, warm smile that reached her eyes. I won't. He gave her a final, respectful nod and turned and walked away, disappearing down the long, empty hallway. Ilara picked up the trophy, feeling its cool, smooth surface. She looked at her reflection in its golden shine. She didn't see a genius or a virtuoso. She just saw herself. A young woman who had been broken and had found a way to put herself back together again, piece by piece, with the only thing she had left, her music. And she knew, with a certainty that filled her entire being, that the music would always be hers now, and no one could ever take it away again.